I'll briefly introduce our guests, but we will expand on their work as we go through this evening's session. To my left is Sheila Watt-Cloutier. Sheila Watt-Cloutier is a widely acclaimed environmental and human rights activist. From 1995 to 2002, she was elected Canadian President of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the ICC. And from 2002 to 2006, she served as the ICC Chair, representing the Inuit of Canada, Greenland, Alaska, USA, and Russia. Watt-Cloutier is of Inuit heritage, having lived in a traditional hunting culture, travelled only by dog team for the first 10 years of her life. In 2007, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for her advocacy work in showing the impact of climate change on human rights of the Inuit. Watt-Cloutier is an official of the Order of Canada, the recipient of the Aboriginal Achievement Award, the UN Champion of the Earth Award, I'd like to have that one, the Norwegian Sophie Prize, and the Right Livelihood Award for Sweden. Her memoir, which is here and is on sale after the event, a wonderful book, The Right to Be Cold, one woman's story of protecting her culture, the Arctic, and the whole planet. So please make Sheila welcome. On my far right is Jared Thomas. Is of Nukanu. He's a Nukanu person, a man of the Southern Flinders Ranges. His novel Sweet Guy was shortlisted for the South Australian and Victoria's Premier Literary Awards, and his novel Calypso Summer won the 2013 State Library of Queensland Black and White Indigenous Literary Fellowship. It was also shortlisted for the 2014 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Indigenous Writing and joined the 2015 International Youth Library White Raven list, given to books that deserve worldwide attention because of their universal themes, exceptional artistic literary style, and just really great reads all round. Songs that sound like blood, I know this book well because I launched it on Saturday, is Jared's latest release. Jared works as the Aboriginal Arts Project Officer at Arts South Australia and is an adjunct lecturer at the University of South Australia. So please also make Jared welcome. Sitting next to me is Jacynta Fuamatu, who I've had the pleasure of working with before. Jacynta Fuamatu is the Melbourne coordinator of 350 Pacific. Her climate journey began in 2013 with the Pacific Climate Warriors, who came to Newcastle to block the world's largest coal port with traditional canoes. Since then, she has continued to work in the movement, sharing stories of lived realities in the Pacific to connect with Australians and mobilising Pacific Islanders in Australia to stand with their Pacific families. So please make Jacynta welcome also. As part of a couple of opening issues, I want to raise the attention of people here tonight to a group of young Australian Indigenous climate change activists, Seed Mob, who you can see that image there. Seed Mob, a remarkable group of young Aboriginal people who are fighting for the rights of the climate in Australia and the planet worldwide by their activism, their sharing of knowledge, of story, and their respect for their elders and communities. When people ask me what can we do in regard to the Indigenous struggle around climate and environmental protection, I could offer up nothing more than to say it is vital that you make contact with SEED if you feel such a need to help Indigenous people in this struggle. I would urge you to look at their website simply by Googling or Firefoxing, whatever you do, Seed Mob. It will take you to their website. And they are a young group who do need our support, whether that be political, moral, ethical support, but of course financial support. So it's one great way that you can help us continue the struggle around this issue. The other thing I'd like to do, and this is in consultation with people, is that we see a very strong connection between what is happening to the planet, what is happening around climate, and the notion of violence more generally in a country like Australia that pays little regard to land in the way that it should be given respect, and less regard to people, or equally a poor regard to people. And I want to briefly read the following statement. The link between climate change, colonial expansion, and the attempted dispossession of Indigenous peoples is unambiguous. The systematic violence committed against Indigenous peoples over many centuries is replicated in acts of violence and environmental vandalism against traditional land and country. We wish to express our condemnation of the violence committed against Indigenous communities and country today. We wish to express our condemnation of the Australian government's use of violence against young Indigenous people in detention and our elders who are vital to the maintenance of country. We also wish to express our opposition to the Australian government's policy of detaining asylum seekers and refugees in offshore prisons. In the near future, our capacity to provide support and care for climate change refugees will be severely tested. We must find a way to act with care and compassion as opposed to the delivery of suffering and pain. Finally, we wish to express our support and solidarity for Indigenous nations across this planet who maintain the deep knowledge vital to the healthy future of country. Thank you. And to open up and begin on a somber note, I don't know if anyone had the experience to read the Australian Guardian this morning, but the Liberal chairman of the federal government, the Coalition's Environmental Policy Commission, Craig Kelly, so therefore the leading spokesman on environmental and climate change within the federal government, had this to say about climate change. He said he's very proud to be a climate skeptic rather than wallow in groupthink or to be a sheep or a lemming. Kelly described himself as in the Born-Lomborg camp, suggesting that wind and solar funding should be channeled into different research because these current renewables like wind and solar had diminishing returns. So with that in mind, I welcome all you lemmings and sheep to the conversation tonight with my fellow sheep or lemmings, whatever they choose to be. I'm going to open the discussion by asking each of our participants, firstly, to just tell us a little bit about the country, nation, communities that you represent or are a part of, and how you're involved with climate change in relationship to those home communities. So can we start with you, Sheila?
Sure. Thank you, first of all. I'm very pleased to be here in Australia. I think the last time I was here was in 1994 during the Indigenous decade when that started. And it's a pleasure to be back here speaking in front of you all. I come from the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, where for us, the ice, the snow, and the cold are a life force for us. And so we witness the most minute of changes to what's happening to our planet. And of course, I've always said that if you want to see, really know the health of our planet, you go and take its pulse in the Arctic, and you will know just how healthy our planet is. So those connections have always been what I have tried to make when I speak to others around the world. My people, the Inuit of the Arctic, we live, as Tony introduced, in Greenland, in Russia, in Canada, and in Alaska, USA. And we are one people. We are one people, although we live in different boundaries and different geography, in different countries, but we all depend on that cold, that ice, and the snow. We have the same legends, we have the same language, different dialects, mind you. And we created, in 1976, an organization that brought us together because we're not very many who sit at the top of the world. We're 165,000 in the entire world that depend on that ice and snow at the top of the world. And so that our voices are not that strong in terms of being able to be out there telling the world what is happening. And so in 1976, when the organization of Inuit Circumpolar Council was created, it was a means to try to unify that voice and make it stronger at the levels that needed to be heard, such as the United Nations and so on. And so that's where I come from. Very humble beginnings. As I said, Tony introduced my own personal beginnings of traveling only by dog team. And so that sense of connection and bond and the power of that cold and ice and snow has been with me since birth. And that's what has given me, I believe, the foundation and the strength to do the work that I do globally, because it's more than just ice. And I'll get into that a little bit later.
Thank you very much. Jacynta?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I just want to point out, I think, I know that my journey in this movement is probably like this much bigger, this small in comparison to Jared and Sheila. So I am here to also learn and listen from this. But a little bit about myself. So my name is Jacynta Louise Fuamatu, which is my married name. But when I was born, it was Jacynta Louise Tarberville. And then when we started school, my dad decided to change it to Jacynta Louise Olano. And I had that name throughout my entire primary school and high school life. And then when I got to uni, my dad wanted to put his chief title name on my degree. So I changed my name again to Jacynta Louise Fuamatu. I was working in a corporate company, and I remember shortly after I got married, I needed to tell HR that I had to change my name again, but I had reenacted the whole conversation, and I just thought, yeah, she's going to ask a lot of questions, because Fuamatu and Fuamau look very similar on paper, and I just couldn't be bothered answering all these questions, so I left it as Fuamatu, and for a long time, I never really understood what that name meant to my dad or to my family. And even though I'm married, I still haven't changed it on Facebook, which is, these days, it's a big deal. And so I learnt that my dad is a very high chief in his village back home in Samoa. It holds a lot of responsibilities and authority, and something I've grown to appreciate. And so now, in comparison to when I first had the name on me, I love it. Now I don't know if I want to change it. That's my husband at the back. I do love you, babe.
Okay. I love Pete too.
But so I got into this climate movement in 2014. I went to a fundraising event one night, and I met a lady who was just giving us some backstory about this event we were organizing, and she shared the story about one of the lived realities in the island of Kiribati, and it wasn't any more than 5 minutes, and in that moment I was sold. I knew this is the movement I wanted to be in. I knew it was so important. I didn't need science data to tell me what climate change was. It was a very simple story. In that moment, I understood what had to be done, and I thought, if that's all it takes to convert people, then that's going to be pretty easy. But it isn't, and I've learned that there is very different levels of activism, and I'm learning this, and this is probably going on to my second year in this movement, and me sort of embracing my culture has become a lot more stronger than it was when I was in school. I was born and raised in Sydney, didn't really acknowledge my heritage until I changed my name and people started asking me questions about where it came from, and until I started fighting in this movement. So, yeah.
Thank you. Jared?
Yeah, I'd also like to acknowledge the owners of country, people of the Kulin Nations, past, present and future. So with myself, my family's Nukana and Nadri from the Flinders Ranges in the mid-north of South Australia. My dad's family and my mother's family's from Winton in Queensland, her Aboriginal family, and I have European background, of course, as well. But I grew up in Port Augusta, and I grew up pretty much with Star Wars and computer games and BMX bikes and AFL footy, but lots of culture and being out on country with my family members. And from a very young age, I started to write. Port Augusta was an incredibly complex place to grow up, and I have a very good sense of our history and the impact of colonisation. And I have a very big family, and yeah, and we've managed to stay together. And today we manage over 4,500 hectares of our traditional country in the Flinders Ranges. So I started writing about the impact of colonisation, and my early works were plays, and my first play was performed in Kenya and Uganda. My second play was about predicting uranium mining in South Australia and what the purpose of the extension of the railway line from Alice Springs through to Darwin. So then I was working very closely with other Aboriginal people, so our neighbours. And today I'm pretty much going to speak about the Adnyamatha. There's some images here of Adnyamatha country. So we're all within the same cultural block. So much of our dreaming stories are similar, and areas of country such as a spring that you'll see in this photo, there's an aquifer that connects into Nukana country. And at the moment, there's a proposed nuclear waste site just near that spring and connects through that aquifer through to Nukana country. So that desecration of that particular area is also a break in our cultural foundation. So yeah, so I've been over the years, I have written fiction that does talk about environmental change. And I think that even if you don't believe in climate change, industry has had a tremendous impact upon Aboriginal people, and particularly Nukana. So it's only in the last 15 years that I've seen whales come back into our Gulf. My father and my grandfather talk about the whole reduction of fish, which was a major source of life. Like if you don't have access to money, you're dependent on country. So shellfish, etc. There was over 1,400 kilometres of oysters that were wiped out in South Australia through the Spencer Gulf from dredging that seabed to make road base. So I could talk about, numerous acts of industry that have had a profound impact on Nukana and other Aboriginal people.
What I might do then, because it is my next question, so we might continue with you, Jared, and come back, Jacynta and Sheila, because my second question is that, clearly we all know that climate change is a global issue, but equally in knowing the work that each of you do, what I would like to know or share with the audience is what are the local impacts that you see that are central to your focus. So in your case, I don't want to preempt, but to talk about the proposals for the Great Australian Bight and the uranium issue, I think would be helpful, if that's okay.
Okay, so the other thing, so there is a proposed oil rig within the Great Australian Bight, and that's said to be one of the most dangerous oil explorations ever. So it's BP, and of course there was a spill within the Gulf of Mexico, which spilled for about, I think, 80 plus days, and it was thousands of litres of oil. So that is proposed, and that's relevant. The Mirning people are really on the front line in terms of responding and speaking about that issue. In this case, there's two proposed nuclear waste dumps. One is proposed to be in this country that we're looking at now. So Adnyamatha people were living at Yapala. Regina McKenzie, who features in a lot of these photos, a couple of years ago, she won a Premier's Award for her work in environmental protection. So this area has artefacts that are 25,000 years plus old. So it's an Indigenous protected area, and now they're proposing to put an above ground nuclear waste facility at that site. And they're talking about low to intermediate waste. And the reason why it's relevant to climate change is because people are putting forth nuclear as an alternative, okay, another energy alternative, and trying to say that it's safe. But when we think about low and intermediate, so low-level waste is toxic for hundreds of years. Intermediate is toxic for tens of thousands, and then high-level waste is toxic for hundreds of thousands of years. So that's the type of pressure that is on this community at the moment. In regards to where I am in the Spencer Gulf, So the CSI projections are saying that Nukana will be affected, our country will be affected by sea level rise first within South Australia.
Okay, so Jacynta, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing with 350?
Yeah, so there's a few things that we're looking at locally. The first thing I think of is West Papua. There's a rise in the momentum in people realising or being aware of what's happening in West Papua, being under the Indonesian government. It's linked to climate change, is that West Papua has a very large mass of rainforests. It's, I think, the second to the Amazon, and it's been untouched, but what we're not seeing a lot of is that they're digging a lot of the land there and not letting the locals know. So they're taking away a huge part of their lifestyle there. At the same time, there's a huge breach in human rights violation there, and it's very hard to get information about what's happening there. But now a lot of videos and photos are being leaked. A lot of the people who have been exiled from West Papua are starting this movement outside of West Papua to raise awareness. And the one way that we're tackling it is to acknowledge West Papua as part of the wider Pacific family, because it's something that we've ignored for a long time. But we have to be very careful, because dealing in that space in West Papua, it's also putting a lot of threat on people who want to get involved and investigate what's happening there. You could get killed. The people would put a wanted sign on your head, and you step foot on West Papua, you'll be killed instantly. But another issue is loss of culture. Climate change is also talking about the possibility of being displaced or moving out of the Pacific and starting a whole new life in another country. So if we don't have land, what's going to contribute to our identity? And that's going to be preserving our traditions and our culture. I see myself as an example of that. I was born here in Australia, and I do not speak or understand my own Samoan language. I didn't really grow up practicing any of the customs, and that is just a very small version of what could possibly happen when a lot of the Pacific people migrate. But we have a Pray for Our Pacific campaign coming up, and it's looking at engaging with the elders in our Pacific communities. I guess the traditional way of doing activism is protesting and doing rallies, but a lot of our people back home are not really into that, or are not comfortable doing that kind of action. So we decided to focus on a main element in our culture, and that's the faith element. Christianity is a huge part of our culture, and just having people dedicate a moment sometime next month to just pray and acknowledge what's happening in the Pacific. It may not seem a lot or a big thing, but to our people back home, that's a huge wave of hope. It's a huge sense of respect for our culture, and it's definitely a good way to engage that 80% of the Pacific who all go to church, and we can finally bring the discussion of climate change in those spaces.
Thank you. One of the things, of course, that you've raised, Jacynta, which is certainly apparent in Sheila's work, but in the work of many Indigenous people, is that you cannot think about climate change without thinking about human rights and social justice. So, Sheila, do you want to tell us what are the pertinent issues for you at the moment?
Mm-hmm. As I said, in the Arctic, the ice and snow is a life force for us. And for us, it's about mobility and transportation. It's about how we travel on that icy highways. And that gets us to our supermarket for us to bring back our food, our country food that we're so connected to, which is highly nutritious. And it is what keeps us warm in minus 50. And so that connection is still very strong in our world. And so when the ice and snow become precarious, and particularly the ice, it becomes right away an issue of safety and security. And so there are more and more of our seasoned hunters that now fall through that thinning ice as a result of what's happening. And so it becomes a very urgent issue for us. And yes, the ice is one of the things that really is much more evident in terms of how it forms differently. And it's harder for our seasoned hunters to read the conditions in that way. But there are many other changes that are happening. The permafrost is melting, so there are homes in certain places where they're buckling inward and they're having to be moved to another place. The coastal erosion is very evident in many places, as we are a coastal people because we are marine mammal hunters. And those changes are very, very stark as well. There are new species of animals, such as birds, fish, insects, that we have never seen before, making their way further and further north. The summers are warmer in many places in the Arctic. It's not uniform, but the trends are the same. We have, the ice breaks apart much earlier in the spring now, much late, and forms much later in the fall, which again just impacts on everything that happens to a hunting culture that is reliant upon a climate and an environment that is predictable and always has been predictable, where the traditional knowledge has always been there to be able to read the conditions and pass down that kind of real, wise, traditional knowledge that we have had for millennia. Many of our elders today will be still teaching what you need to do, not only to survive, but to thrive and become a proficient provider for your families and your community. But now, once they start to train and continue to say, this is what needs to be, this is what you need to learn, this is the conditions and so on, there's now a disclaimer for many, and they say, however, because of climate change, it's not always the case. It's much harder to predict, much harder to read the conditions in that way. So it is an issue of immediacy, for us on a daily basis, where you would now worry much more than you ever did when your hunters go off on the land and your family goes off on the land as a result.
One of the things which was apparent looking at your work, which is that globally, or the discussion of a threshold of temperature rise, and at Paris there was talks of 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. One of the things that you point out is, in fact, that in the Arctic, that figure has already been surpassed.
It has been. And we have to be very cautious about, this whole notion that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It impacts upon everybody else. And yes, we're already there in many cases. This is probably my most favorite picture of all, because it really indicates, the joy in being in the cold is just who we are. And so for us, that's what it's all about. But yes, getting back to the Arctic is the cooling system for the planet. It is the air conditioner, if you will. That air conditioner is actually breaking down for the planet. And as a result, you see the small island developing states and other places the sea level is rising. And so you can't get clearer than that in terms of understanding the connectivity. That was my grandson when he was younger, on a boat hunting with his father. And so we have to keep that image of the Arctic smelt is impacting everywhere else in the world. And I would assume here as well, if there's more droughts and wildfires and so on as a result. So everything is interconnected in that way. And so that's been the message as well, is that if you protect if you protect the Arctic, you can literally save the planet because of that connection that exists.
Thank you very much. One of the things looking at those images, Sheila was talking, I can't remember, by the way, if it's in the book, or I looked at several of Sheila's lectures and conversations, and I have a bit of a wool fetish, but when she started talking about this wonderful interrelation qualities of what your moccasins and your coats, I thought, I want one of those. But if I had one in Melbourne, I'd be sweating like crazy. But just back to Jared, and again, this will be for each of you. One of the things that Jared and I have talked about, well, not only over the last few days, certainly when we were in Washington last year, is that we know, again, this is an issue that is affecting Indigenous communities now. And we know, of course, that Indigenous communities and poorer communities also will feel the effects of climate change more immediately and more drastically and with great damage. How do you feel, or how's your level of confidence, I suppose, about other groups that you work with outside your own community? So I'm talking about non-Indigenous activists, because in Australia, and certainly I think it's something that comes up in Sheila's work, there has been some, at times, tension and fractious relationship with environmental groups. So when you're thinking about the issue of the nuclear waste dump, or what BP are planning in the Great Australian Bight, or the issues of climate change generally, how do you see those relationships working between Indigenous communities and other groups?
I mean, there's great examples of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people working together in Victoria against fracking. So that, you know, they're really heartening stories of resistance and pastoralists that have really started to understand the effect of early colonial practices on Aboriginal people, and then joined together to fight, you know, fracking attempts, etc. There's going to be a meeting soon between people of the Adnyamatha people and also Anangal people, so Piranjara, Yankunytjatjara, Nayamjara, and people from that group, they were severely affected, of course, from the atomic testing. So they're concerned about, you know, the various impacts on climate change. And, you know, South Australia is the driest continent, the driest state in the world. So they're also, of course, in a very arid environment and concerned about those effects. I'm seeing a lot of pastoralists around this area, non-Indigenous pastoralists and community members, that are starting to form those strong alliances with Aboriginal people and really wanting to listen to Aboriginal knowledge. And I think people are really starting to understand a lot more the value of that knowledge, because, you know, our families have lived there for thousands of generations. And it's a very, if you're kind of new to that area, it appears to be inhospitable. But of course, our knowledge provides us access and survival skills within that landscape, where there are some of the most dangerous snakes in the world. And so there is that solidarity that's starting to develop, and it really needs to continue. And that is one of the good things in the last couple of years, is seeing that movement develop between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in South Australia and more broadly across the nation.
Thank you. And Jacynta, we're at 350?
Yeah, we're experiencing the same thing. Seed Mob is a perfect example, and they, from a Pacific point of view, we see them as an example in this movement, because they have such a clearer and stronger understanding of their fight. And for the Pacific, climate change is a new word for them. They may have they may have not have called it climate change for a long time, but yeah, the seas are rising, our plantations are getting destroyed, but they would never in a long time called it climate change. So climate change is evolving in Pacific communities, and we do rely on our alliance with the Seed Mob. And recently we do a lot of work with 350 Australia. So 350.org has a lot of teams around the world, and we work together a lot. And we always, after an action, regroup and talk about the things that didn't work and how we could improve. And one thing that stands out for me is activism in Australia is very different to activism in the Pacific. You know, in Australia, it's kind of a good thing when someone gets arrested and is in the newspapers. People cheer, and I guess activism is seen as very aggressive and demanding. But in the Pacific, it's not. That's kind of frowned upon, and we do things that it can be just as powerful but much more peaceful. And we had this example kind of guide us in the way we work in the future. Having a Pacific Islander arrested may be good for the Australian community, but it doesn't do anything for us in the Pacific. And working together like that, it really does show that we are developing in this movement, even inside internally. So. Yeah.
My mum always tells me never to get arrested when I go to a protest. So it happens in Melbourne too. Sheila, you've obviously worked across the whole range of communities in what you've done in Canada.
Well, the ICC, which was the Inuit Circumpolar Council that was created back in '76 to bring the 4 countries together, or the Inuit of the 4 countries together, have been at this for quite some time. '76 was when it was created. And we have this observer status within the UN, so we're able to go and intervene at many of those events that happen around climate change, but around many other biodiversity and so on. So we've been mobilized for quite some time and have become rather effective in being able to bridge some of those huge divides that exist in the world, not just in terms of trying to work with other countries and other governments, but also to bring together Indigenous peoples who work together. At the Arctic Council level, we work with 8 countries that have Indigenous peoples that live in all of those 8 countries. And so we've always been working very closely together. The Sami of northern Norway, Finland, and Russia, and Sweden are the people that we have worked the closest with over the years. And so we see the power in Indigenous peoples coming together to work on these issues together. Because for us, it's, the commonality is that we are so closely linked to our land and our culture and our way of life. We depend on that environment for our food source still. And we depend on that to teach our children about how to become the people that they are meant to become, the children that they are meant to have that strength and that focus and that inclusivity and to respect everything that is all around you. And so for us, the hunting culture, yes, the actual technical aspect of the hunt and the harvest are really important techniques and skills to learn, but just as equally important is the character building skills that you learn out there on that land and that ice. And what I mean by that is you're learning patience immediately as you're waiting for the weather to subside or the snow to fall, the ice to form. You're learning about yourself. You're learning how to be courageous at the right time. You're learning the survival-based risks that are necessary, not just to live on that land, but it's transferable to the modern world when the stressors come at you. It's a powerful teaching that Indigenous peoples have in terms of that respect for each other. And so ultimately, we're teaching our children to develop sound judgment and wisdom so that those skills that they learn on the land, they're going to be able to deal with the modern stressors that come. So it's not about either or, because in our world, the young people that are making it are the ones that have a foot in each door, on each place, and have a respect and a teaching of the elders and how to deal with these issues of life. But also they're the ones that are able to balance the new world when it comes at them. And we're trying to, for us in the Inuit world, we have the highest suicide rates in North America. And a lot of it is as a result of the tumultuous change that has happened without a sense of control over our lives, but also the historical traumas that colonialism has brought to our world as well. The forced relocations, the animal rights movements, children being sent away at a very young age, losing our language. I'm one of those kids. I was 10. We have all these histories, but we never quite put them into a context to be able to understand that it's not a weakness in us as Indigenous peoples that struggle. It is really because we have had to go through so much turmoil and trauma. And so that trauma is what we have to address to try to get it back. And the trauma that Indigenous peoples have gone through all these decades now is the same trauma we're inflicting upon our planet. And we have to make those kinds of connections now as to what do we need to do. Just as we need to address the issues of the human trauma of Indigenous peoples, it isn't about climate change anymore, it's about climate trauma. And anyone who's in denial is really, is unfortunately not dependent upon the well-being of their environment for their food source, for their safety, for their health, for education, all of those things that as Indigenous peoples we are connected.
I'll come back to that in a moment because I want to talk about what you've written and spoken about, connection and disconnection.
Right.
But one of the, I mean, clearly, as Sheila is talking, there are people in the audience nodding their head, I think partly as a response to understanding this is a very similar situation in Australia and in some ways very similar histories. I remember once I gave an academic paper in the US and the First Nation academics said, well, we could have given each other's papers, we could have swapped them and they would have worked.
Strong connections.
And why I made that statement that I read at the start tonight, I wrote a short piece on my blog after the Dondale Four Corners program of the torture and incarceration of Indigenous youth in the Northern Territory. And one of my objectives in this fellowship is to try and bring Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people together as an act of trust and to work on this issue. And I think what some people don't realise is when Aboriginal people see that terrible act of violence on television or witness it in their own families or their kids coming out of detention, and then someone approaches them to say, we want to work with you as non-Aboriginal people, there's already a barrier that's been established and it's very difficult to break. You talk about what has happened with the disconnect in relationship to communities, individuals and country or land. Clearly it's something that has affected Western capitalism, but yeah, when you talk about suicide rates and in your own community, it's something that impacts on Indigenous communities as well. What potential do you see in, this is more philosophical now, in Indigenous engagement of understanding of land? What is the potential to engage non-Indigenous people with that ethic, with that practice of life that can be both maintain authority and integrity and be able to educate and share? And how difficult is that when we consider colonial legacies?
Yes. Well, it is difficult, there's no doubt, because there is still that divide and there is still the mistrust that is happening in our world. I mean, just an example of that ongoing dialogue that we have with trying to protect our way of life, and then Greenpeace coming up to help one of our small communities now who's fighting against seismic testing in the oceans where there's so much marine life. So that still exists in terms of the mistrust. But I think what we have to do here is come to common ground through our common humanity, and that's what this is about. It's not a divide anymore in that sense, and I think, you know, we're all in this together, and we can do this together. We've got this. If we could just see ourselves and not other one another, but to try to understand that the plight of Indigenous peoples around the world on climate change isn't just, for example, it isn't just about the Inuit fighting for their right to be cold. I remember somebody once said, but what about my right to be warm? I said, don't worry about that. You're going to be warm. You're going to be very warm. So don't worry about that. But if you can connect to the fact, you know, the issue that, you know, whether it's the Arctic, Inuit of the Arctic defending their right to be cold, or others who are defending their right to their rightful healthy environment, it's about all of us. That fight that we do as Indigenous peoples is about your right, no matter who you are, to your right to a healthy environment and your children's future. So in that sense, if we can come together on common ground to better understand the histories of why we struggle so much in our communities and the histories of all that, and that's what I've tried to do with the book, is put it into a context that resonates so that everyone around the world, no matter who you are, whether you're an Inuk, whether you're an Indigenous person from another part of the world, whether you're a mother, a grandmother, a father, grandfather, anywhere, you can resonate and somehow see yourself in it. And some of the feedback I've been getting has been positive in that way. And that's what I've tried to do is bridge that gap that exists. Because, you know, when people are skeptical or, you know, skeptics on climate change, really that disconnect becomes even more clear when we hear that happen, being said either by leaders or other people, because it is that disconnect that has happened, between, especially the urban settings that are not reliant so much on their environment to survive every single day. So it's that disconnect to your food source, to your environment, to nature, to one another, that we are debating this issue of climate change in the first place. And so we've got to bring all of us together to try to come on board and understand these issues for what they mean. Because what happens in those communities will affect everybody else. And we're already seeing that. About a decade, 15 years ago, when I started to give some of these talks on, especially the toxins issue that we're ending up in the Arctic, in the nursing milk of our mothers. And it was very clear that disconnect was huge there. So I think we have to now realize that what is happening in the Arctic is affecting everyone else, and that we just have to better understand one another on those terms.
Jared?
I wouldn't mind just talking as well about that issue of respect and trust and risk. So, and I'm, again with Adyamatna, so they have a term, Yuramura, in their language. And we talk about the dreaming, but Yuramura is their specific term for the dreaming. So Yura being person and Mura being country. It's a connection between person and country. You give to country and country will give back to you. That's the arrangement. That is the deal. So Adyamatna, like other people, in terms of our spirituality, it's all about looking after country and looking after people. So we're constantly trying to teach our kids about respect. That respect for others, extending beyond Aboriginal people, and respect for our country and lands. So, and then when we come to trust, so, going back to the oyster beds that were eroded. For many groups across South Australia, we had our water sources used for steam trains, so then go our soakages. So with industry, we just we can't trust it. And we're certainly not at the point to be able to trust things like nuclear waste and nuclear refinement. Because in order to have trust, we need to have some history together that's working out well. Right. So that we can then go forward. And then we can take more risk together as communities. At the moment, one of the risks that Aboriginal people are really prepared to take in South Australia is concentrated solar thermal. So there is a proposed concentrated solar thermal site for Port Augusta. So again, non-Aboriginal people and Aboriginal people are working together. We've seen the closure of the coal-fired powered power plant in the last year. So both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people need that economy. And we're saying we want this. We want concentrated solar thermal for Port Augusta, and particularly in place of a uranium waste dump to bring money into the state.
Thank you. And Jacynta, I was really interested because when you started, you were sort of making excuses, I'm just beginning on this journey. But when you then talked quite seriously about, what is the difference between being arrested in Melbourne and being arrested in the Pacific, or, even if you're arrested in Australia, I don't think your family would be that happy about it. Is it in that there's something quite effective in that? And to me, just listening to that, my immediate thought was, there's something I need to learn here. So what do you think Pacific Islander communities have that, again, Indigenous people from around the globe or non-Indigenous people can learn from?
Yeah, I have to be very careful about this. I think it comes down to privilege. When we had our climate warriors come over from the Pacific and we sent them around Australia to do some solidarity events, speaking events, and the one thing that was, I guess, a priority in all this was put them in arrestable positions, that way people will listen. And they weren't really understanding how that's going to impact The Pacific people, I mean, you know, their visas can get taken off them. They may not be able to travel ever, and if they go in jail, who's gonna, like, we don't have the funds to get them out. We don't have the funds for their court cases. But if it was someone who is born in Australia, an Australian citizen in that position, the impacts are different. You know, there is that support to get them out. They're from here. They're not going to be deported anywhere else. They're not facing those kind of risks. And when it was such a huge debrief on just learning the different cultures. We you know, these Pacific Islanders, English is their second language, and just running training to prepare them for these actions, the language that was used to conduct the training, you know, they didn't understand it. It wasn't, I guess, broken down in a simple language for them. And when the Islanders were getting a bit confused because they didn't understand. So instead of thinking, oh, I need to break down the information, they thought shouting or repeating and getting louder would help. And, you know, they didn't see that as, you know, that's very disrespectful. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it did affect trust, and it was going to be a huge problem every time we work with teams that are not from the Pacific. And it was a huge chunk that we never consider when working with other groups is culture, customs, formalities. There's a whole, I mean, when you host Pacific Islanders, you need a lot of money to get food. You know, food is such a big thing. And when I run information sessions just in my local communities, I know that what I have to share is very important. But no one's going to come if I just have information. I need to meet them halfway. I need to get a band, a DJ. I need to have some food. So, I mean, if they're going to walk away and not agree with what I've shared, at least
let's have good food.
Yeah. And, you know, then you can try again later. There's another day there's another opportunity to get their attention another time. I think trust is a big thing that we need to research. It's something that once it's broken, it takes a long time to fix it. But again, in the Pacific, time is not there's not a lot of time for us. And I think working with other communities is definitely something we want to do because we don't have a choice. We don't have other options. And, you know, we have a very strong understanding of what could happen to us. I mean, I use the example of my family from Tuvalu who, you know, their island is sinking, and there's talks already going on, well, if it goes down, I'm going to stay to the end. This is my land. This is where my family are from. My ancestors are here. I'm staying to the end. So you bring all my family from Australia and New Zealand to come visit me because I'm going to stay here. And I don't think a lot of people are at that stage of comprehending, like, what it takes to even comfortably talk about that stuff in front of your family. And yeah, that just shows time plays a big part in planning and working with other communities. Time is just something we don't have, and things need to happen now.
Thank you. We're about to take questions. I think the roving mics are going to come down. Just while people are thinking of your questions, and we certainly welcome them, I think that it's a very important comment that Jacynta has made, because we talk about urgency quite a lot, and we do realise that we're in a situation of urgency, but it is difficult because when you're talking about negotiating relationships and effective relationships, you also require patience and time. So these two things seem as opposites, but we clearly have to find a balance because you don't want to disenfranchise people who you're hoping to work with. Who wants to start the proceedings off with a really wonderful question? There's one down, yeah. You're gone.
Hi, my name's Louis Helbig, and from my accent, you might know that I like the cold as well, too. I'm from Canada. And Sheila, you and I worked together once on a conference that I organized with CUSO, Community and the Impact of Climate Change in Winnipeg. And we brought people together from around the world to talk about not the science so much, but the impact at a community level. And I know there were folks down from Arctic Bay, et cetera, who spoke about that, and I think really moved a lot of people to sort of help to begin to understand what was going on. Since then, I've recently moved here, and last year I put a book together on the tar sands, this one right here, which is this pivotal project in Canada, a symbol for many, many different things. And as an aerial photographer and an artist, I sort of put the book forward and provided space for a whole variety of people from across the spectrum to sort of comment on the issue, climate change, et cetera. And one of the things that struck me, and part of the book, Chief Alan Adam, who is one of the Aboriginals affected by, the First Nations affected by what's going on he's in the book. And what I did in the book is I included the two First Nations languages, the Cree dialect and the Dene Saline. And I did that because I thought that one of the issues as we try to understand, and I see some of this coming through in the comments that were made, is that there is really absolutely an absence of a relationship, of a sort of a romance, of a sentiment, an understanding of the landscape that seems to sort of elude us, certainly in Canada, in that sort of narrow strip of most people living along the sort of urban border. And I wonder if you could sort of speak to that a bit. We don't romance the landscape at some level. We don't sentimentalize it, I suppose. Most Canadians don't. And I think maybe that sort of helps to abstract and to let us do the sort of things that we have done in northern Alberta with the tar sands.
Well, I don't know.
Oh, no, you're right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes?
Yeah.
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I mean, I think we protect what we love. Simple as that. And as you know, being a Canadian, we absolutely love our Arctic, and we love our landscape, and we love the ice. We love all of that. So we protect what we love. And I think that's what it is trying to get the world, not necessarily just to love the Arctic, but to love the very land that is here in front of us, no matter where we live. And in that sense, I mean, I think if you read the introduction to my book, that's basically what I'm walking people through is the beauty of the land and just how much that gives you in terms of the solace and the peace and how surreal it is in that sense. And somehow I think that is lost. I agree with you. I think that's lost in the understanding of what land represents for us. You know, it's easy enough, I think, in the urban setting to lose that sense of connection and that love and the romance of, you know, what that gives you. And that's...
I mean, it's interesting in the Australian situation, though, if you look at early settlers' diaries, and certainly someone like Major Thomas Mitchell, who was the chief surveyor of the New South Wales Colony, he does romanticise about land quite and sentimentalise around land. And I think in Australia that there is a romanticism attached to particular aesthetics or understandings of how land works, but it's certainly not enabled settler societies to love land. It's quite a different thing. So therefore land has suffered greatly. The other thing, of course, and I don't know if Jared may have response to this, there's a wonderful example in Australia when there was a proposed uranium mining for Coronation Hill, which was an important landscape to an elder by the name of Nipper Brown. And he lived in a tin shack. Coronation Hill was a fairly scrubby, not, postcard attractive piece of land. And the general response to that by Europeans was, well, look, who cares if you blow this up? It's not Uluru. The point being, to Nipper Brown, it was as vital as any landscape that another Aboriginal person might covet. And what the romantic image was is that Uluru is something we would not dare dynamite, but we can dynamite this hill because we can dynamite this hill because it means nothing. To Aboriginal people, that notion of the postcard aesthetic has no provenance. So it's often difficult to explain to non-Aboriginal people why land is so vital, even though it may look unattractive to the European eye.
Yeah, and also the financial value of place. Like obviously, there's areas that are being promoted as tourist destinations, but what has more value, the tourist income or the income from mining, etc. So there is that real contradiction that is occurring, I think. But there are certainly images that have won movements as well. Just while we're going to another question, if I can take the opportunity to kind of bring to people's attention that there will be a National Day of Action on October 15th against the proposed national waste dumps. Some of the organisations that I do trust and people I trust, the No Dump Alliance and Friends of the Earth, who are working on the dumping campaign. Also the Solar Power for Port Augusta campaign. When we talk about the mining, the oil in the Great Australian Bight, Bunna Laurie, a great Mirning elder, of course, who's working with Clean Bight Alliance and also the Wilderness Society. So I really encourage people to go to those sources of information, because it is where Aboriginal people are having the conversations in this country, not in the mainstream media, amongst all that white noise, but through those particular channels. That's where we're having the dialogue.
Okay, there's a question in the second row here.
Thank you. Bruce Howard from New Zealand. Up until World War I, the relationship was with government and sovereignties. That's where they passed laws that allowed them to get away with all sorts of interesting acts. Since World War II, I would hypothesise that the relationship is now between corporate organisations and government. And I'm wondering, I'd be interested in all of your responses to the impact that is having on both Indigenous people and on the whole climate change. And I pick up on your thing about youth suicide, because I know with our Indigenous Maori people in New Zealand, we're suffering the same things, and I think they're all interrelated. I'd be interested in your commentary.
Yeah, I guess, look, I mean, for me to look at that question, I would be reading a non-Indigenous activist who's Naomi Klein, who does have those relationships with Indigenous people across the world. And I think that she speaks very well about those issues and bringing Aboriginal voice to the fore as well. Sheila, and do you guys want to add to that?
Do you want to ask? I mean, I've got something I want to add, but Sheila first.
Well, the corporate world, are you meaning the industries that go up? Yeah. Well, for us, I mean, that's the challenge we have right now in the Arctic, is that as the ice melts, the rich resources are starting to surface and become much more accessible for mining companies, oil and gas, all of those, the seismic testing that's happening now in some of the regions, and the small community of Clyde River that's fighting and defending its way. And in fact, the Supreme Court of Canada is going to be hearing their case. Because the irony of all of that is that in our communities, there is poverty, there is hunger, people are hungry for jobs, and there are none except for, you know, the governmental service jobs that exist in our communities. And people are wanting to have a better way of life. The cost of living is 2 to 3 times higher than anywhere else in southern Canada. It's a really hard place to live in that sense. And so here we have these mining companies that are coming in and dangling that big carrot, that only carrot that people want. And so it's very ironic that we would be then moving towards that kind of industry that has been known to be very dangerous and leaving huge footprints and terrible devastation in other Indigenous lands of the world. So why would we in the Arctic be so trusting of companies that are devastating other parts of the world? Are these companies going to actually reinvent themselves for us, the people of the Arctic? I don't think so. And so, we have to be very cautious. But that's the dilemma that we're in right now, because that's the big carrot that's being dangled in the Arctic for people who are really desperate for jobs.
I mean, the question is so valid and pertinent to Australia in regard to fossil fuel industries, which is clearly an issue for climate change. And what's happening with the relationship between corporations and governments is that corporations take on the role of government provider and then they can remove that role. So just to give you an example, if a corporation wants to go into Aboriginal country and mine, and they get permission for mining that lease from government, as part of that, the government may say to that company, and they do, well, what you need to do is provide infrastructure for the Indigenous community. So in other words, to take over and provide what would otherwise should be government services. Services that we in cities take for granted that we will be provided with, power, water, etc. So the corporations go into the communities and they provide those utilities. Now, when the mining leases end or mining leases fail, the corporations leave the communities. They not only leave holes in the ground, that utilities that require services are no longer serviced and they break down very quickly. You then get a knock-on effect of this, and we knew this in the floods of Northern Territory in January 1915, that if you live in a community where the utilities are already in disrepair, and then you go for a major weather event, as we're experiencing more often with climate, the ability to have that infrastructure repaired becomes a lot more difficult. So in other words, communities that are already under stress come under greater stress. The other relative point here, and people might want to consider the Queensland government's approval and the federal court's approval of the Carmichael coal mine, otherwise known as the Adani coal mine, is that for that mine to go ahead without the permission of Indigenous people on country will require the extinguishment of the Native Title Act. So while people might celebrate native title as a step forward and an outcome for Indigenous people, it can be removed at a whim to support corporate interests. So a lot of people around and globally are talking about this. It's the loss of democratic processes and the collapse of democratic institutions, and these multinational corporations, which are global entities and are answerable to no single nation, have the ability to have an impact on communities all over the world. So it is a major, major problem. It is 7:12 and we only have 3 minutes. I don't know if we would take a quick question or... Okay, we'll have a quick question and a quick answer as well.
Well, I don't know if you can give a quick answer, but I will ask quickly.
Okay, that's half.
Right, halfway. So look, it's easy to become frustrated with and bemoan climate change denialism. What would each of you do to try and convert a denier into a believer?
That's a great question, and we'll get a quick response from everyone.
I don't bother. I just don't bother because, and it's also, it's also racism in this country. I try to keep myself sane and healthy by ganging up with people that have shared interests, because there's a lot of work to do, and it's a distraction. Okay, so you take your energy and your power from others that are on the same team, and we just keep working. Okay, and there's enough material out there now that people should be able to find their own way to it. Okay, there's so much wonderful, Sheila's lectures, her book, etc. A whole lot of other authors, Indigenous peoples. It's out there. So don't worry about them. It's about working together with those people that we're already there in alliance.
Yeah, the same. Well, it depends. I still have a lot of family members who don't believe in climate change, and as much as I like to ignore them, I still find it an opportunity for me to brush up and research on the movement as well. So I kind of use them as a way to test me and my knowledge. But after COP21, I feel it was a sense of relief that the world leaders were able to acknowledge that climate change was real, and that was enough for me. I was like, oh, we don't have to do any more work on converting climate deniers, because it's done. We've got work to do. We're going to move on and start applying some solutions. Yeah.
Sheila?
Yeah, no, I don't spend a lot of time with deniers myself and expend my energy on that. It is more with people who are willing to listen and learn and work together, and that's the way I do things.
Yeah. And just to close, I was thinking that the Pauline Hanson party, she has a spokesperson. You might have seen him perform on Q&A a few weeks ago, a major intellectual figure, but I think I would take him to Kiribati and I'd tie him to a tree and leave him there and see what happens. But no, I wouldn't. Metaphorically. I'm going to take a leaf out of your family's book and do something peaceful. See, this is a problem going up in Melbourne. You have all sort of gangster solutions. Okay. Look, I really want to thank our speakers. Jacinta was very nervous. I think Jared was mildly nervous, and I know Sheila was jet-lagged. I don't know if that cures you of nerves. You get a bit spacey. I was a little bit nervous, and I'm not usually so. I've just really loved the conversation. I have great respect for each of our speakers, and I'm sure that you're all going to go away and be invigorated by what you've heard, read people's books, listen to what people have to say, and please, please get involved in this issue. We need people to get involved. And as I mentioned earlier, please hang around if you've got more questions, but stay until 8:45 and listen to Tom Doig and George Monbiot take some of these and other issues up further. So thank you very much. Thank you, that was wonderful.